Those who preferred sweetness could request mulsum, wine blended with honey, though this was a small luxury rarely offered in simple taverns. People drank standing up, clay cups held casually between conversations. A worker might take a sip between mouthfuls of stew, wipe his mouth on the back of his hand, and dive right back into a heated argument about the next gladiator match. Wine loosened tongues, softened tempers, and made the midday rush feel a little lighter. It also fueled more reckless conversations, sharp jokes about corrupt officials, bold fantasies about wealth, or whispered comments about attractive neighbours passing by. But wine wasn't the only essential drink. Water, gathered from Rome's famous aqueduct-fed fountains, played its part too. Boys from the Thermopolium fetched it in ceramic jugs, weaving through crowds as they carried precious supplies back to the tavern. Fresh water cooled the pots, thinned stews, and eased the constant heat of the kitchen. Yet Romans rarely drank it alone. Many believed plain water was unhealthy unless mixed with wine or boiled into broth. In this constant interplay between water and wine, Romans found the perfect companion to street food, refreshing, familiar, and as lively as the city itself. Whether rich, poor, sober, or slightly buzzing, every customer lifted their cup with the same simple pleasure. A small comfort in the middle of Rome's unending chaos. Eating at a Thermopolium was never just about food. It was about navigating the wild, unpredictable world of the Roman streets. For every comforting bowl of stew and every friendly debate about gladiators, there lurked an entire ecosystem of opportunists, performers, and troublemakers who thrived in the crowded chaos. A man might enter the tavern hungry and relaxed, but he always kept one hand on his coin pouch. Rome was magnificent, yes, but it was also full of people ready to seize a moment's distraction. Among the most skilled were the pickpockets, often young boys or wiry teenagers working in pairs. One would bump a customer by accident, perhaps spilling a bit of wine on his tunic, while the other slipped nimble fingers into a purse. By the time the victim muttered a curse and wiped off the spill, the thief had already vanished into the crowd. Thermopolia were perfect hunting grounds, busy, loud, and filled with customers juggling bowls, cups, and conversations. A single moment of laughter or irritation was all a thief needed. Still, not everyone in the crowd was dangerous. Many came simply to entertain. Street performers hovered near the Thermopolium entrances, hoping the sense of warm food would draw spectators and coins. A juggler might toss clay cups into the air, balancing one on his forehead as children shrieked in delight. A flute player stood by a fountain, filling the air with a lilting melody that rose above the noise. Some storytellers recited heroic epics or whispered scandalous tales, adjusting their performance depending on who gathered to listen. Their presence added colour and charm, turning a simple lunch into a moment of shared amusement. But the streets held other risks too, risks that had nothing to do with criminals. A startled horse could suddenly bolt, sending carts crashing into market stalls. A delivery of amphorae might spill, fragments of pottery scattering across the stones. And in the most crowded districts, a small fire in a nearby apartment could send waves of smoke rolling down the street, forcing people to scatter in panic. In such moments, customers grabbed their bowls and moved as quickly as they could, cursing the city's cramped design, even as they accepted it as part of daily life. Despite all this, Romans kept returning to the Thermopolia. Danger didn't deter them. It was simply another thread in Rome's vast, living tapestry. To eat here was to embrace the city fully, its warmth, its flavour, its danger, and its unstoppable pulse. And for most Romans, that was reason enough to stay. By the time the sun dipped behind Rome's rooftops, the Thermopolium began to change character. The heat of the day softened into a warm glow, shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, and the rush of midday slowly unravelled into something looser, calmer, almost reflective. Yet the tavern did not truly quiet, not in a city that rarely slept. Instead, it shifted into a different rhythm, one that revealed just how essential these humble street taverns were to the identity of ancient Rome. For many Romans, The Thermopolium was not merely a place to eat. It was the closest thing they had to a neighbourhood hub, a public living room, and a shared refuge. Most of the city's population lived in cramped insulae, apartment blocks with thin walls, smoky hallways, and limited space for cooking. Homes were for sleeping, not eating. So when hunger struck, the solution lay on the street. In the warm jars of stew, the sharp tang of garum, the clatter of bowls against stone counters, and the easy company of strangers. In this sense, the Thermopolium became a great equaliser. Here, fishermen rubbed shoulders with clerks, slaves and freedmen whispered gossip beside weary craftsmen. Even the occasional soldier on leave would stop in, armour dusty, sword clattering softly at his side as he ordered a quick portion of pulse. Rank mattered everywhere in Rome, everywhere except here, where everyone stood in the same posture, bowl in hand, waiting for the ladle to scrape the bottom of the pot. Night brought new conversations. Older men lingered longer, debating politics or recalling battles from their youth. Young lovers stole glances over cups of watered wine. Workers finishing late shifts arrived hungry, grateful that the tavern's coals still glowed. Even travellers used the Thermopolium as a compass. If you wanted to know what a neighbourhood was like, all you had to do was listen to the chatter around its street tavern. And though few customers ever said it aloud, the Thermopolium also carried a quiet emotional weight. It offered comfort after a long day, familiarity in a city that changed constantly, and companionship in a world where most people fought hard simply to survive. A warm bowl of lentils couldn't erase hardship, but it could make a man feel grounded, human, alive. By closing time, the owner wiped down the counters, banked the embers, and stacked empty bowls. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Rome would awaken hungry, noisy, restless, and the Thermopolium would be ready, waiting to feed not just bodies, but the very spirit of the city. Before the first hint of dawn touched the tiled rooftops of Edo, the Ashigaru barracks were already stirring. Life for these foot soldiers was shaped by discipline, routine, and the quiet acceptance that, even in an age of peace, the role of a warrior never truly slept. Their day began not with leisure, but with the sharp wooden hyoshigi clapped together by a supervising officer, the sound echoing through the wooden corridors like a command from the dark itself. One strike was enough to wake even the deepest sleeper. Inside the long, sparsely furnished room, Ashigaru rose from simple straw mats laid neatly in rows. Their bedding had no softness, but the men barely noticed. They were used to the hardness of soldierly life. Each man folded his thin futon with practiced motions, smoothing the corners until they were exact. Nothing in the barracks was allowed to look sloppy. Not blankets, not clothing, not a single pair of sandals left at the wrong angle. Order reflected loyalty, and loyalty reflected honour. The faint smell of the previous night's fire still lingered. Someone quietly stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a small bundle of kindling until the flames revived, giving the room a dim amber glow. Ashigaru warmed their hands just long enough to chase away the morning chill before moving on to their chores. Silence dominated these early moments, broken only by the rustling of fabric, the clatter of wooden buckets, and the soft creak of floorboards as men prepared for another long day. A typical morning task was sweeping the courtyard, an exercise in mindfulness as much as cleanliness. Ashigaru moved in lines, pulling long-handled bamboo brooms over gravel paths, fallen leaves, and thin drifts of dust. Their movements were steady and rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Edo might have been a peaceful city, but the samurai ethos demanded constant readiness. To live in an orderly space was to keep the mind sharp. After sweeping came the inspection of equipment. Spears were checked for cracks, spearheads polished until they glinted even in low light armour pieces. Light, practical, rarely used in actual battle, were aired out and brushed free of dust. A man's attire reflected his worth, even if that attire spent most days hanging in storage. Only when everything was in order did the Ashigaru line up in the courtyard, breath misting in the cold morning air, awaiting instructions. The sun had still not risen fully, yet their work had already begun. Such was the rhythm of Ashigaru life, quiet, disciplined, and rooted in the belief that even in peaceful times, a warrior must rise before the world. For all the discipline woven into an Ashigaru's routine, nothing grounded their daily life more than the meals that sustained them. Food in the barracks was simple, humble, repetitive, and utterly essential. It lacked the refinement of samurai banquets or the richness found in merchant households. Yet for the Ashigaru, these meals were the quiet anchor of every day. The morning ration was predictable: steamed white rice, served in a wooden bowl still warm from the pot. Rice was more than food. It was the symbol of a domain's wealth, the backbone of the entire hierarchy. To receive a daily ration, even a small one, was a reminder that the Ashigaru served their lord directly. Every grain held meaning. Alongside the rice came miso soup, thin but comforting, made from fermented soybean paste dissolved in hot water, sometimes enriched with scraps of tofu or pieces of green onion when supplies allowed. Pickles, tsukemono, added a sharp, salty bite to each meal. Pickled daikon, cucumber, or plum. Their strong flavour cut through the plainness of rice and kept the palate awake. Occasionally, dried fish was served, chewy and briny, a reminder of Japan's reliance on the sea. On rare days, when the domain's budget permitted, or when the quartermaster was feeling charitable, they received a small piece of fresh fish or boiled vegetables. Such moments were quietly celebrated, though never openly. Modesty was part of a soldier's character. Meals were eaten quickly and without conversation. Sitting cross-legged, Ashigaru lowered their heads, not out of fear, but habit. Speaking during meals was discouraged. The food was meant to nourish the body, not distract the mind. Wooden bowls clacked gently against the floor, chopsticks tapped lightly against rims, and the steam rising from miso soup gave the barracks a warm, earthy scent. The midday meal often mirrored the morning one, though sometimes with porridge instead of rice, stretched thin to feed many mouths. Evenings, however, were the quietest and most reflective mealtime of the day. After hours of drilling or guard duty, Ashigaru gathered again for rice, soup, and pickles, the soft amber glow of lanterns casting their shadows against the wooden walls. They did not dine like noble warriors. Their meals lacked ceremony, luxury, or variety. Yet these simple rations kept them steady, fuel for the long, uneventful days that defined life in the Edo period. In a world where battles rarely came, nourishment became a kind of silent discipline, a daily reminder that strength was built as much from patience as from steel. After the morning meal, the courtyard of the barracks transformed into a training ground. Though Japan lived under the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Ashigaru were still expected to train as if war might return tomorrow. Their primary weapon was the yari, the spear, and mastering it required endless repetition. Not elegant swordplay, not poetic duels, but thrust, step, recover, again, again, again. The yari itself was deceptively simple, a long wooden shaft capped with a polished steel blade. Depending on the domain, a spear could be as short as 2 meters or nearly twice that length. Ashigaru carried these weapons not for ceremony, but practicality. Spears created distance, control, and formation, the backbone of battlefield strategy in centuries past. Even if wars no longer raged, the old traditions demanded readiness. Training began with stance work. Ashigaru planted their feet in gravel, knees bent, shoulders loose but firm. An officer paced behind them, correcting posture with the butt of his own spear. A tap on the leg meant lower. A tap on the shoulder meant relax. A louder tap, accompanied by a sigh, meant do it again. Then came thrust drills, 100 thrusts forward, 100 thrusts angled, 100 sweeping motions meant to break the charge of an imaginary rider. Each movement had to be sharp, controlled, and in time with the group, spears sliced the air in unison, their wooden shafts vibrating faintly with each strike. The sound of training, shuf, 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 echoed across the courtyard like a heartbeat. Sweat gathered quickly, even on cool mornings. Some men gritted their teeth, others controlled their breaths to conserve strength. A few younger recruits trained with too much enthusiasm, their thrusts exaggerated, earning amused glances from older soldiers who had long since learned that true discipline was quiet, steady, and unshowy. Beyond the drills, Ashigaru practiced formation movement. Rows shifted together, stepping forward and back with the precision of a single body. Officers called out commands, short, sharp syllables carried on the air. The men pivoted, lowered spears, raised them again, simulating the phalanx-like lines their ancestors once formed on chaotic Sengoku battlefields. By late morning, arms ached, thighs burned, and palms stung from gripping the wooden shaft. Yet training rarely ended early. Even in peacetime, Ashigaru were judged by the sharpness of their discipline and the unity of their movements. A warrior without a war was still expected to behave like one. And so the spear drills continued, day after day. Habits forged not for glory, but for duty, tradition, and the quiet pride of belonging to a lineage of soldiers whose strength came from repetition. If spear training built the body, guard duty tested the spirit. In the Edo period, an age of peace tightly maintained by the Tokugawa shogunate, battles were scarce, but rules were abundant. Castles, gates, bridges, storehouses, and official residences all required constant supervision. And it was the Ashigaru, the lowest-ranking warriors, who performed this long, monotonous watch. It was both an honour and a burden. Assignments rotated daily. One morning, a man might be stationed at the castle gate, standing rigid beside towering wooden doors, greeting officials as they passed. Another day, he might patrol the outer moat, listening to the croak of frogs and the distant hum of townspeople, all while keeping an eye out for thieves, drunks, or suspicious wanderers. At night, he might guard the fire watchtowers, scanning the dark horizon for the dreaded glow of flames. The greatest fear in a tightly packed wooden city like Edo guard duty demanded stillness. Hours passed with little more than the occasional nod to a passing merchant or a quiet exchange with another guard at the end of a shift. The Ashigaru stood with spear or staff in hand, armour tied neatly, face set in a neutral expression that conveyed alertness, but not aggression. Showing boredom was frowned upon. Showing fatigue was worse. The warrior ethos insisted on a calm, steady presence. Yet inside, their thoughts drifted. Some silently recited poetry. Others planned what they would do on their next rest day. A few daydreamed about earning a small promotion or distinction, though such achievements were rare for men of their rank. Many simply endured, knowing that their watch was part of the invisible machinery that kept Edo safe and orderly. Occasionally, something broke the monotony. A noble procession swept past in a blur of lacquered palanquins and colourful banners. A group of rowdy labourers needed calming. A lost child approached, crying, and the Ashigaru guided him back to his mother. Once in a great while, a fire bell rang. And then every second mattered. Every man springing into motion to direct citizens, form barriers, and coordinate buckets of water. Most days, however, guard duty was quiet. The city did not erupt in rebellion, samurai did not charge through the gates, and thieves rarely attempted bold crimes near watchposts. Ashigaru performed their role faithfully, even when it felt thankless. In peace, their greatest strength was patience, for they were warriors who guarded not battlefields, but the fragile calm of the world around them. Between training drills and long hours of guard duty, Ashigaru lived in a world defined not by heroic battles, but by small practical tasks that filled the quiet stretches of their days. Peace in the Edo period meant that most foot soldiers spent far more time sweeping, repairing, and maintaining than fighting. And life between wars became a slow rhythm of survival, routine, and small comforts. Many Ashigaru turned to fishing during their free time. Armed with little more than a bamboo rod and a simple line, they walked to nearby rivers or castle moats, hoping to catch carp or small river fish they could grill over a modest fire. Fishing wasn't just about food, it was a rare moment of solitude. Sitting by the water, listening to the soft ripple of currents, gave them space to breathe in a life otherwise filled with commands and duties. Some never caught anything, but even returning empty-handed felt better than staying cooped up in the barracks. Others filled the hours with maintenance chores. Spears dull easily, and armour grows stiff if neglected, so Ashigaru often sat outside in the shade, carefully oiling spear shafts, tightening armour cords, or patching worn tabby socks. The work was repetitive but grounding. It reminded them that even if no enemy marched against their domain, a warrior cared for his tools as faithfully as a monk tended his temple. Some men cultivated small vegetable patches near the barracks, tiny squares of earth where they grew green onions, radishes, or herbs to flavour their otherwise plain meals. These gardens required little space and even less skill, but they brought quiet pride. A handful of fresh greens shared among friends could transform an ordinary pot of rice into a small feast. During hotter months, Ashigaru gathered under trees to mend straw sandals, carve wooden charms, or simply talk. They spoke not of grand strategy, but of practical worries. The price of rice, the temperament of their superiors, or the small hopes they carried for their families. A few men even practiced writing, their brushes tracing careful strokes on scrap paper as they tried to improve their characters. In the absence of war, life became a long lesson in patience. These simple activities, humble, quiet, often overlooked, kept the Ashigaru anchored. Their days were not filled with the thunder of battle or the glory of heroic charges, but with the steady, unremarkable tasks that allowed them to endure. And in many ways this slow rhythm shaped them more deeply than any battlefield ever could. For all their rough duties and humble status, many Ashigaru nurtured a surprisingly quiet inner world. The long peace of the Edo period left them with stretches of time between duties, hours that could have easily dissolved into boredom or restlessness. Instead, many turned inward, embracing the arts that had long been respected throughout Japan. Among these, haiku writing and simple calligraphy became gentle companions in an otherwise rigid life. Haiku appealed to the Ashigaru for its simplicity and clarity. It asked for no lavish ink, no expensive paper, no complex schooling, only observation, honesty, and a brief moment of stillness. After a day of polishing spears or standing guard at a castle gate, an Ashigaru might sit beneath a barracks eave, listening to the wind rustle through bamboo. In that quiet space, he could condense a feeling, a season, or a fleeting moment into 17 syllables. A single frog leaping into water. The creak of an old gate at dusk. Lantern light trembling on a rainy night. These were not the grand themes of noble poets, but the small truths of daily soldierly life. Writing haiku wasn't about impressing others. It was about grounding oneself, capturing one breath of clarity in a world ruled by order and obligation. Calligraphy, though more demanding, offered similar solace. Ashigaru often practiced with cheap brushes and ink diluted to stretch supplies. They copied simple characters again and again, tracing their strokes with slow precision. The goal wasn't perfection but improvement, a quiet discipline mirroring their martial training. Each brushstroke required balance, control of breath, and a steady hand. In some ways, it was another form of combat training, a battle against impatience, distraction, and self-doubt. A few Ashigaru kept personal diaries, recording thoughts, weather patterns, or small events from the day. Others exchanged poems with fellow soldiers, a practice that built quiet bonds in a communal life where privacy was scarce. Even those who weren't literate sometimes asked friends to write poems for them, preserving shared moments in ink. These artistic practices softened the mental burden of barracks life. They allowed the Ashigaru to remain warriors without hardening into stone. For men whose days were spent polishing weapons they rarely used, art became a gentle reminder that life held beauty beyond duty, that a soldier could still be a human being with thoughts, emotions, and a quiet longing for meaning. In a peaceful era where swords stayed sheathed, it was often the ink brush, not the spear, that shaped an Ashigaru's heart. Though Ashigaru lived with discipline shaped by their lords, their deeper sense of balance came from something quieter. faith. The Edo period was an age in which everyday life blended seamlessly with spiritual practice. Even for low-ranking warriors, men who rarely saw battle and often faced uncertainty about the future, shrines offered a steady place of grounding. Prayer, ritual, and simple gestures of devotion shaped the emotional rhythm of their lives, just as much as training or guard duty. Near every castle town stood small Shinto shrines, usually tucked beneath tall cedars or beside quiet footpaths. Ashigaru often visited these shrines during rest hours, approaching the wooden torii gate with bowed heads and slow steps. They washed their hands at the purification basin, the cold water flowing over calloused palms worn from spear practice. It was a small act, but one that symbolized clearing the mind. Inside the shrine grounds, the world seemed to exhale. Crickets sang, leaves rustled overhead. Wind chimes softly chimed against each other. Here the relentless structure of barracks life loosened its grip. Ashigaru clapped twice, bowed deeply, and whispered their hopes. Modest hopes, rarely grand. Some prayed for health or favourable weather. Others prayed for their families in distant villages. A few asked simply for strength to endure another year of duty. In the evenings, lantern-lit paths glowed softly as Ashigaru walked to local Buddhist temples as well. Buddhism offered them a sense of introspection, a reminder that suffering and hardship were part of life's natural cycle. Listening to a monk's chant drifting from within the temple hall, they felt the weight of their daily routines ease, even if only briefly. Seasonal festivals were especially meaningful. During the new year, Ashigaru gathered with townspeople to offer the first prayers of the year, ring bells, and warmed themselves with sweet rice wine. In summer, they visited shrines during Obon, lighting small lanterns to honor ancestors. Although they were soldiers, they participated just as any commoner did, humble visitors seeking connection with something larger than themselves. Spiritual practice was not grand or dramatic for them. It was gentle, woven into the margins of their days, a bowed head before duty, a small talisman tied to a spear shaft, a whispered haiku that doubled as a prayer. These moments reminded the Ashigaru that they were not merely workers in armour, but individuals with inner lives shaped by tradition and belief. In an era of peace where battles faded into memory, it was often the shrine, not the battlefield, that shaped the warrior's soul. Life as an Ashigaru was not glamorous, heroic, or adorned with the sweeping legends sung about higher-ranking samurai. Yet within the barracks, those long wooden rooms filled with straw mats, clattering bowls, and shared routines, a different kind of strength emerged. Camaraderie. A brotherhood forged not by battle, but by boredom, duty, and the quiet hardships of everyday life. The men lived shoulder to shoulder. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Everyone heard when someone sneezed, sighed, muttered in sleep, or shifted restlessly during the night. Instead of driving them apart, these close quarters wove the soldiers into a strange, informal family. Arguments happened, of course, usually about chores or who borrowed whose tool without asking, but they rarely lasted. Life in the barracks was too interconnected for grudges. During slow afternoons, Ashigaru shared small stories from home. One man spoke of rice fields in his village, another of siblings he rarely saw, another of a wife he hoped to marry once his wages improved. These were not dramatic tales of valour. They were simple glimpses of quiet lives waiting beyond the barracks walls. Listening to each other became a kind of comfort. Older Ashigaru often acted like unofficial mentors, offering practical advice. How to knot armour cords so they wouldn't loosen, how to stretch rice rations when pay was delayed, how to fold bedding fast enough to avoid reprimand. Their guidance carried the tone of men who had long surrendered the dream of rising in rank, but wished to spare younger recruits unnecessary trouble. Evenings, after the final duties were done, carried a unique warmth. Lanterns glowed softly, casting long yellow shadows across the wooden floors. Some men gathered around with small flasks of cheap sake, sipping cautiously, knowing drunkenness was strictly forbidden. Others played simple board games like shogi, their strategy pieces sliding softly across worn wooden grids. Laughter rose in low, hushed bursts, never loud enough to disturb officers, but enough to loosen the stiffness that training had hammered into their bones. On colder nights, when the barracks shuttered its doors against the wind, Ashigaru huddled around the hearth. They shared roasted chestnuts, traded gossip about their superiors, or debated which local festival had the best food stalls. For a moment, hierarchy melted. They were no longer ranks beneath ranks, but men keeping the night at bay together. This camaraderie didn't make life easier, but it made it livable. In a world where war rarely called and advancement was slow, companionship became the Ashigaru's greatest source of resilience. Their battles were few, but their brotherhood was constant. By the time lanterns dimmed and the barracks settled into silence, a strange truth always lingered in the minds of many Ashigaru. They were warriors without wars. The Edo period was an era shaped by peace so enduring that entire generations of soldiers never saw battle. Their spears stayed polished but unused, their armour maintained yet untouched by combat. And though this peace spared countless lives, it also created a quiet tension within the men who had been raised to fight, but were instead asked simply to endure. Some Ashigaru accepted this with gratitude. Peace meant stability, steady meals, steady pay, and the comfort of routine. They could grow old without fear of dying on muddy fields beneath enemy arrows. They could finish their duties and walk to shrines, fish rivers, write poems, and build small futures that chaos would have stolen from them in earlier eras. For these men, the lack of war was a blessing, but others felt the weight of it like a stone hidden under their armour. Stories of past battles, tales of valour from fathers and grandfathers who fought in the Sengoku period, echoed louder in their imaginations than the quiet rhythms of daily life. Some young recruits trained with feverish intensity, hoping secretly that a moment of danger might finally come. Yet nothing came. The shogunate's peace held firm, and the Ashigaru's spears remained pointed at nothing but practiced dummies in the empty air. The contradiction defined their lives. Trained to protect, yet rarely given the chance to prove their worth. Their days passed in long stretches of discipline, humility, and patience, virtues the age demanded. And perhaps it was precisely this quiet perseverance that allowed Edo society to flourish. Warriors who did not fight became guardians of order, stability, and public life. Their presence at gates, temples, warehouses, and bridges reminded the people that peace was not accidental. It was maintained by countless watchful eyes. When the nights grew cold and the barracks creaked softly under the wind, Ashigaru sometimes sat awake, staring at the faint glow of dying embers. They wondered what legacy they would leave behind. No battlefield tales, no heroic banners, no songs sung in their honour, and yet, in the calm of their long duties, in the loyalty they upheld, in the quiet strength they carried through years of uneventful service, they shaped an era more profoundly than they realised. Their lack of battle did not diminish them. Instead, it made them the silent pillars of a peaceful age. Warriors without wars, but essential all the same. Walk down a narrow Roman side street, one of those cramped alleys where the buildings lean inward like gossiping neighbours, and you will eventually find it, a Popina, the beating heart of working-class Rome. You hear it before you see it. Laughter spills out the door, mixed with shouting, clattering bowls, and the muffled thump of feet shifting on worn floorboards. Push aside the wooden curtain or slip through the uneven doorway, and you step into a world completely unlike the marble-clad villas and polished forums that define Rome in imagination. This is where the real city eats. The first thing that hits you is the smell. A thick, smoky haze hangs in the air from oil lamps and small clay stoves. The aroma of cheap wine, sour and sharp, mixes with bubbling lentil stew and the unmistakable tang of hot garum, Rome's favourite fermented fish sauce. It sizzles in pans, clings to the air, and seeps into clothes so deeply that regular customers carry its scent long after leaving. Some joke that you could follow a man's social class simply by his garum cloud. Next comes the crowded chaos. A popina is small, barely enough space for a counter, a stove, a few shelves of pottery, and a handful of benches shoved into corners. Yet somehow, 20 people manage to fit themselves inside, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder. The room hums with life. Dock workers gulping stew, beggars warming their hands over oil lamps, gamblers rolling dice in the back, and labourers arguing about chariot races as though their honour depends on it. Along the far wall sits the iconic dolium counter, a stone or brick worktop with circular openings that hold sunken clay jars. From these, hot stew, olives, chickpeas, meat scraps, and mulled wine are ladled out with startling speed. The innkeeper, often loud and broad-shouldered, moves like a conductor in a symphony of hunger, scooping, pouring, and shouting prices over the din. Behind him, a smoky brazier keeps the food warm, its coals glowing like the centre of a small furnace. Space is so tight that customers rarely sit properly. Most lean, crouch, or perch on whatever surface is free. They clutch clay bowls in one hand, bread in the other, eating quickly before someone bumps their elbow and steals a bite. It is messy, loud, and utterly alive. This is the Roman popina, not grand, not elegant, but essential. A refuge of heat, food, and human noise, Rome's unsung theatre of survival. Step closer to the counter, and the heart of the popina reveals itself. A cluster of clay pots, each sunken into the stone counter like miniature cauldrons. Their contents simmer all day, filling the tiny room with rich, salty perfume. The innkeeper lifts each lid with a practiced flick, letting bursts of steam escape, steam carrying the flavours that defined the working-class Roman diet. The most common pot holds pulse, a thick porridge made of wheat or barley. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, pulse was the backbone of poor diets. It absorbed whatever ingredients the innkeeper could afford that week. Carrots, onions, wilted greens, occasionally a sliver of pork. Next to it bubbled lentil stew, dark and hearty, seasoned with garlic and lovage. The lentils softened into a creamy blend that coated the tongue with warmth, perfect for labourers whose work didn't wait for full stomachs. Then there was the aroma that ruled the room. Garum. Not just any garum, but hot garum, gently warmed until its pungent, fermented bite expanded into every corner of the tavern. The popina used it on everything. A ladle over stew, a drizzle over bread, a splash in wine, even mixed into sauces for olives or pickled vegetables. It was Rome's universal seasoning, as essential as salt is today, yet far more assertive. Bread formed the popina's unofficial utensils. Customers tore off dense chunks, dipping them into stews or mopping up stray streaks of sauce. The loaves were round, stamped with a bakery mark, and often slightly burnt at the edges, evidence of hurried baking in Rome's massive communal ovens. Other pots held chickpeas simmered with herbs, pickled fish, and vegetables stewed in cheap olive oil. Some taverns served a small amount of meat, but it was rarely generous, scraps, trimmings, or cuts too tough for the wealthy. Still, when mixed with garum and eaten piping hot, even the simplest meat could feel like a feast. And then there was wine, never served pure but diluted heavily with water to stretch the supply, its sharp edge softened when warmed slightly or mixed with spices. Customers drank it from small clay cups, the rims chipped from years of being knocked together in toasts, arguments, or drunken clumsiness. Everything in the popina had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Every flavour, strong, salty, smoky, was designed to sustain bodies pushed to their limits in Rome's demanding workforce. These were not the foods of luxury, but of life. Food that filled, comforted, and pushed men through another day in the great city that never slowed down. Inside a Roman popina, silence did not exist. The moment you stepped in, the small room swallowed you in a storm of noise, heat, and movement. Oil lamps flickered restlessly, casting jittering shadows across the walls. Smoke curled upward from the brazier, hugging the ceiling beams until the air itself felt thick enough to drink. The warmth hit you like a wave, relentless, familiar. oddly comforting. This was not a place for nobles seeking refinement. This was the furnace where the working class came to thaw their bones and escape the cold reality of Rome's hard labour. Every sound competed for dominance. A group of men shouted over a game of alea, dice clattering against the wooden table. A barge worker laughed so loudly his voice cut through the room like a knife. The innkeeper barked orders to his assistant. "More oil! More wine! Watch the pot!" while a customer complained that his stew was too watery. In the corner, someone cursed his luck at the dice. In another, a pair of friends argued heatedly about which gladiator would triumph in the next games. Outside, the street noise seeped in, the rumble of carts, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional call of a vendor selling figs or grilled fish. But inside the tavern, everything was amplified by the cramped space. Even the scrape of a clay bowl across the counter sounded like a declaration of hunger. And then there were the smells, layers upon layers of them. Burning oil, sour wine, warm bread, fish sauce, sweat, damp tunics, cheap perfume, and the occasional whiff of wet wool from customers escaping a sudden rainstorm. They fused into a scent that was unmistakable, unforgettable, and impossible to wash away from one's clothes. Regulars joked that you could always tell a Peppina goer by how many dogs followed him home, lured by the lingering aroma of garum. People moved constantly. Someone squeezed past carrying a bowl. Another leaned awkwardly against the counter because there were no free seats. A pickpocket pretended to fix his sandal while eyeing someone's purse. A vendor stepped inside briefly to sell roasted nuts before being shooed out by the tavern keeper. The entire room churned like a human tide, cramped, smoky, loud. But beneath the chaos lay a deeper truth. This was one of the few places where Rome's poor felt life stirring around them. The Peppina didn't judge their worn tunics or empty pockets. Here, a man was not rich or poor, only hungry or satisfied, cold or warm, alone or among his own. It was chaos, yes, but it was their chaos, their refuge, their Rome. If food gave the Peppina its aroma, wine gave it its pulse. Every class in Rome drank wine, but in the taverns it flowed differently, cheaper, harsher, and mixed with enough water to stretch a single jug into many. Purity was a luxury reserved for the upper classes. In the Peppina, wine was a tool, something to loosen tongues, to soften sore muscles, and to briefly blur the harshness of Roman life. Behind the counter, the innkeeper kept large clay amphorae leaning against the wall, sealed with wax and smelling faintly of vinegar and herbs. The wine they contained was often mass-produced, transported from distant provinces, oxidized by long travel, and cut with water that had been scooped from the nearest public fountain. Yet regulars lined up for it eagerly. They didn't drink for flavour. They drank for warmth, camaraderie, and the few minutes of relief each cup provided. The ritual was simple but essential. The innkeeper scooped wine using a small ladle, poured it into clay cups, then splashed in water from a wooden bucket. Sometimes he flavoured it with honey or herbs to mask the sourness. Sometimes the wine was reheated to give it a soothing edge, and sometimes it was served cold and sharp, tasting like the amphora itself. But nobody complained, not seriously. Complaints were part of the performance. A typical evening scene: a group of labourers with blistered hands leaning over a shared table, cups raised in a clumsy toast. To another day survived. Nearby, a pair of gamblers argued over dice, sloshing their wine with every gesture. A fisherman, still smelling of the Tiber, gulped his drink in 2 swallows, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and asked for another. A woman who'd been selling vegetables in the market sipped her diluted wine slowly, savouring the rare moment when her body wasn't moving from stall to stall. And mixed among them were the troublemakers, the men who drank too fast, whose voices rose too high, whose tempers began to spark. The innkeeper kept a sharp eye on these customers. One overturned cup could ignite a brawl, and one brawl could ruin a night's business. So he barked warnings, pushed elbows apart, and occasionally threw a drunk into the street before chaos could spread. For Rome's poor, wine was not a luxury. It was part of their survival strategy. It washed down stew, warmed cold bones, and softened the exhausting weight of the day. In the Popina, each cup was less about pleasure and more about endurance. Here, drinking was not escape. It was ritual. A shared moment of lightness before the world's burdens returned. When the sun dipped behind Rome's insulae and the streets turned dusky and narrow, the Popina transformed. By day it was a refuge for labourers seeking a quick meal. By night it became something deeper, louder, and far more unpredictable. Oil lamps flickered to life one by one, casting wavering golden halos across the cramped room. Shadows lengthened, corners darkened, and the atmosphere thickened like steam rising from a boiling pot. Night brought in a new kind of crowd. Men just off their shifts at the docks limped inside with aching backs and heavy footsteps. Washerwomen, their arms raw from scrubbing laundry, stopped by for a cup of wine before heading home. A few prostitutes leaned against the counter, chatting with potential clients, using the warm light to soften the hard lines of the day. Dice players reappeared like moths drawn to the glow, slapping their palms with excitement as they rolled bones across tables that wobbled on uneven legs. The sounds grew denser too. Laughter sharpened. Arguments grew bolder. The scrape of chairs, the pounding of fists on wood, the clatter of falling bowls. Every noise seemed magnified in the tight quarters. Even the innkeeper's voice shifted from daytime barks to nighttime roars. "No credit," he shouted. "Pay now or get out." Yet he also slipped regulars an extra ladle of stew, knowing full well they'd return again tomorrow. Food tasted different at night. The stews thickened as they simmered for hours, absorbing the flavours of vegetables, bones, spices, and the ever-present garum bread, once fresh, turned tougher but perfect for soaking up leftover broth. Occasionally a pot of spiced beans or grilled fish was added to the menu, reserved for customers who arrived late but hungry. The smoky air made everything richer, even if it soothed no one's lungs. Outside, Rome's nighttime sounds seeped inward. Drunken singing, arguments in distant alleys, stray dogs barking, the clank of a night watchman's staff against the pavement. But inside the Popina, the warmth wrapped itself around every tired body, creating a kind of fragile sanctuary. For a few hours the people inside forgot the cold rooms awaiting them, the debts they owed, the work waiting at dawn. By the time the innkeeper finally closed the door, sweeping customers out with gruff farewells, the Popina felt like a fire that had burned bright and then dimmed. The coals glowed faintly, bowls lay stacked, and the lingering smell of garum clung to the walls. Night in the Popina wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. A place where the city dropped its armour and breathed, loudly, roughly, but together. A Roman Popina was never just a place. It was a crossroads of lives. Step inside at any hour, and you encountered a shifting cast of characters, each with their own burdens, ambitions and stories. The tavern didn't care who you were before entering. Once inside, everyone belonged to the same smoky, noisy, chaotic world. At the centre of this world stood the Popa, the tavern keeper. Usually broad-shouldered, loud, and immune to the heat of the brazier, he moved with the confidence of a man who knew every regular by name, and by debt. He settled arguments with one look, tossed out troublemakers without ceremony, and could ladle stew, pour wine, and negotiate prices all in a single breath. His wife, if he had one, usually managed the money box or scolded customers who tried to flirt. Beside them were the labourers, dockworkers, carpenters, porters, bricklayers, and builders whose bodies bore the marks of endless toil. Their tunics were stained from sweat and dust, their hands rough and cut. They came for warmth, for calories, and for a moment when the city stopped demanding something from them, they leaned heavily against counters, exhaled loudly, and ate with the intensity of men refuelling for survival. Then came the gamblers, always huddled in corners, rolling dice carved from bone or knuckle bones. Their eyes darted constantly, half at the game, half at potential marks. A lucky streak could buy a night of stew and wine. A bad roll could turn into a fistfight. Dice clicked across tabletops like sparks waiting to ignite trouble. The Papina also attracted prostitutes, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace, sharing jokes with customers and offering company for a few coins. Their laughter brightened the room, even when their eyes showed exhaustion. They were part of the tavern's rhythm, never still, always navigating bodies and conversations. Begging for scraps were street children, barefoot and quick. They slipped in unnoticed, grabbed crusts of bread left on tables, and fled before the innkeeper shouted, "Rome's poor were everywhere," and the Popina was one of the few places where leftovers appeared with regularity. Sometimes a soldier off duty would wander in, his armour dusty, his cloak smelling of campfire. He sat straight-backed, watching the crowd with habitually alert eyes, yet softened by wine and familiarity. Even he, armed and disciplined, blended into the tavern's swirling human mass. Everyone inside carried a different story, but in the Papina, cramped, smoky, alive, they became the same. Hungry souls looking for warmth, company, and a moment's escape from Rome's relentless pace. The tavern was their refuge, their stage, their gathering place. A small world inside the vast empire. For all its warmth and noise, a Roman Papina carried an undercurrent of danger that pulsed beneath the laughter and clattering bowls. The tavern was a haven for the poor, yes, but also for the desperate, the cunning, and the reckless. Anyone who stepped inside accepted an unspoken truth. The Papina fed you, warmed you, sheltered you, but it could rob you just as quickly. The most common threat came from pickpockets. Boys no older than 12 or 13 who slipped between patrons like smoke. They pretended to fetch water, adjust sandals, or beg for scraps. In reality, their sharp fingers hunted for loose coin pouches or untied belts. A distracted gambler or a drunk labourer made the perfect target. Some men learned to keep one hand on their cup and the other on their money. Then there were the con artists, grown men who used dice, charm, and a well-practiced story to separate a fool from his pay. They bragged loudly, bought a round of wine to gain trust, and then invited strangers to friendly games of Alea. The stakes rose too quickly, the dice rolled too smoothly, and by the end of the night, someone stormed out cursing their own naivety. The brawlers were another problem, men whose tempers flared as quickly as the wine flowed. A spilled drink, a lost game, a crude joke, or a sharp insult could ignite a whirlwind of fists and overturned bowls. The innkeeper usually had to intervene, wielding a wooden ladle like a weapon, shouting louder than the fighters themselves. Sometimes he ended the fight with a shove out the door. Other times, he simply let the troublemakers punch themselves tired, knowing they'd sober up soon enough. But the most feared presence in the tavern was the thief who worked for gangs, a man who entered quietly, watched silently, and chose victims carefully. He rarely stole inside the Papina. Instead, he followed men outside, trailing them down dark alleys where the only witnesses were stray dogs. A single shove, a quick grab, and he vanished into the narrow labyrinth of Rome's back streets. Even the tavern keeper lived with risk. Selling wine without proper dilution, serving spoiled stew, or angering the wrong customer could bring authorities, or worse, a local gang, crashing down on his livelihood. He walked a tightrope every night, trying to keep peace in a room built for chaos. Yet, despite all the dangers, people returned. Because danger was everywhere in Rome, on the streets, in the markets, on the docks, at least in the Papina, you faced it with a bowl in your hands, warmth on your skin, and a crowd around you. Risk was simply part of the tavern's rhythm, and the poor understood rhythm better than anyone. If Rome's forums were the stage of senators, poets, and generals, then the Papina was the theatre of the poor, a place where everyday Romans told their stories, vented their frustrations, and spun gossip into the lifeblood of the night. No matter how cramped the room or how thin the stew, the tavern served something far more intoxicating than diluted wine. Conversation. Gossip flowed faster than the innkeeper could ladle stew. A dock worker, fresh from unloading ships at Ostia, leaned over his bowl to announce that grain shipments were delayed. "Prices will rise. Mark my words." Another man swore he saw a senator's wife sneaking into a bathhouse with someone who was not her husband. Two gamblers in the corner whispered about a new gladiator from Thrace, claiming he could slice a man open before he even raised his shield. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. In the Popina, stories became currency. People talked with their whole bodies. A fisherman slapped the counter to emphasize a point. A seamstress rolled her eyes so dramatically the whole room laughed. A man who had never left the city claimed he once saw a sea serpent off the coast, stretching his arms so wide that a nearby customer nearly lost his wine. Even lies became entertainment. And then there were the storytellers, those natural performers who turned every misfortune into a comedic tale. One described being chased by a goose in the forum with such tragic flair that the entire Popina erupted in laughter. Another reenacted his failed attempt to flirt with a merchant's daughter, complete with exaggerated gestures that left even the innkeeper chuckling. For many, this nightly exchange of words was a lifeline. Life in Rome's insulae was harsh. Cramped rooms, collapsing staircases, fires, thieves, endless work. But in the Popina, even the poorest Roman could feel heard. He could share his joys and failures, complain about taxes, mock pretentious elites, or brag about things he'd never actually done. The tavern gave him an audience. Women contributed to the chatter too. Washerwomen joked about the mountains of dirty tunics they scrubbed, vendors shared news from the markets. Prostitutes teased customers with quick wit and sharper humour than most men could handle. In this smoky little room, storytelling was survival. The Popina transformed everyday struggle into a communal performance, messy, loud, and beautifully human. Rome outside was enormous and indifferent, but inside the tavern, everyone had a voice. Everyone mattered. By the time the last customers drained their cups and the innkeeper snuffed out the oil lamps one by one, the Popina held a softened, almost tender silence. Smoke still floated lazily beneath the rafters. The counter, wiped roughly with a damp cloth, glistened faintly in the dying light. Empty bowls were stacked haphazardly, breadcrumbs littered the floor, and the faint scent of garum, always garum, clung stubbornly to every surface. But beneath the noise and grime, something deeper lingered. The sense that this small room was more than a tavern. It was a lifeline. For the poor of Rome, the Popina was warmth when their insulae were freezing, light when their apartments were dark, and company when the city felt too vast and uncaring. Home was often a single rented room, shared with too many bodies and riddled with damp, rats, or collapsing walls. But inside the tavern, there was fire, stew, voices, and motion. Even the chaos here felt safer than the silence of a cold, empty room. It was in places like these, not the Senate, not the villas, not the palaces, where the real Rome breathed. Popinae and Tabernae were the daily pulse of the working class, the forgotten majority who built the aqueducts, repaired the streets, loaded the ships, baked the bread, and carried the empire on tired backs. And though these taverns were rowdy, smoky, and packed elbow to elbow, they offered what no law or emperor ever could. A sense of belonging friendships formed here. Rivalries, too. A man could walk in with nothing in his purse and still walk out having laughed, argued, eaten, and remembered for a moment that he was alive. The Popina offered community to those who spent their days unseen. In a place where class differences ruled everything, the tavern was one of the few spaces where lines blurred. A fisherman could sit beside a porter, a seamstress beside a gambler, a runaway slave beside a storyteller, and no one cared, as long as they didn't start a fight. Even the innkeeper, for all his shouting and stern warnings, played the role of guardian. He knew who needed extra stew, who needed credit, who needed to be thrown out before their temper sparked a brawl. He presided over his domain like a king of clay pots and wine buckets. When he finally locked the door and the last ember dimmed, the street outside felt colder, quieter, stripped of its heartbeat. But the Popina would open again at dawn. The stew would bubble, the wine would flow, the stories would rise. Because for Rome's poor, this smoky room was not just a tavern. It was survival, warmth, identity and community. A small world inside a massive empire. Their world, their refuge, their Rome.